So this has taken a little bit longer than I would have liked, but welcome to the very first episode of Bubba Kate versus the State. This initial episode I'm going to call Bubba Kate versus the State of Marxist Education, and in it I'm going to outline the Afrocentric, globo-Marxist, anti-white hostility, harassment, discrimination and abuse now endemic throughout our education system. Then I shall cover my own experiences of political and racial discrimination that I endured at my former university. And finally, the legal action that I brought against them after the victimisation that I was subjected to for raising my concerns and complaints about the anti-white messaging and the discriminatory practices, policies and provisions of my former university. So, most of us are aware that our universities, in fact our entire education system now, is heavily infested and influenced by Marxist agents and activists who seek to indoctrinate rather than educate their students. Most of you watching may have had a family member or you yourself gone on into higher education and found that the vast majority of your professors and those that work within education are fanatically left-wing. Now, if you're a white student and you don't hate yourself for being white or feel that you're privileged, so should be discriminated against, bombarded with anti-white propaganda and harassed by your educational provider, then not objecting to the Afrocentric anti-white hostility and discrimination that we're subjected to throughout our studies can be rather difficult. However, many don't object and many don't complain, and very few take any sort of action against their universities or educational providers for the discrimination, the hostility, the harassment through the anti-white messaging that they're subjected to, because they're aware that if you do not adhere to and regurgitate the Marxist ideals of your professors, the education providers, or their student militant Antifa BLM terror squads, then you're quite likely to end up being subjected to abuse, harassment, unwarranted and malicious disciplinaries, and even the complete sabotage of your education. So this really intimidates and dissuades most students from taking action, white students, because they just want to get their qualifications. So they'll just keep their mouths shut and refuse to actually protest against the overt anti-white agenda that they're being subjected to. I mean, it's reached a stage now where university professors will openly state white lives don't matter and that they want to abolish whiteness. I mean, this is a core principle of critical race theory, which is the foundations behind this anti-white agenda that they're pushing through our education system, which teaches that all white people are inherently racist and oppressive from birth, and that the only way that non-white people can be free of racism and oppression is by abolishing whiteness, which of course you could only do by eradicating white people. So it is an ideology of white genocide, and this is now endemic throughout our education system. We have teachers and professors saying that they want to demoralize and traumatize white students. There's even been experiments conducted with white pupils and black pupils where they've been separated, where white students are subjected to a bombardment of negative disinformation about their race, their history, their heritage and their culture, to demoralize and traumatize them, while the black students and non-white students are all grouped together to be told all positive things, most of it Afrocentric fantasy, but then they put these kids together and give only the black and ethnic minority kids cupcakes to demoralize the white kids further because they're evil and wicked just for being born white, of course. And this is going unchallenged. We see discriminatory scholarships only for black and ethnic minorities. When one was offered for disadvantaged white students, which, by the way, the white working class are one of the smallest demographics in the United Kingdom going on into higher education. This was refused by most education providers because they didn't want to help white disadvantaged kids. I mean, there is an entire video that I'm going to share to my channel and to all of my websites. I hopefully will be able to find the creator of it, but quite often people who produce this kind of content like to remain anonymous due to the persecution that they face. But yes, I will post that rather than continuing to talk about the kinds of discrimination we face, because I think it's something that we're all aware of. And like I've said before, I'm not really a content creator and I'm not here just to discuss and define problems. I want to talk about solutions. So this brings me round to my own personal experiences of political and racial discrimination that I was subjected to by my former university, and my process of attempting to raise my complaints and concerns, and how that led into victimisation and them trying to report me to Prevent, and officers knocking on my door asking me why I didn't like Black Lives Matter. Yes, it's got to that stage. And eventually I've had to take it to the county courts, which I think is the only option left available for white students who aren't taken seriously and are subjected to disciplinaries and victimization if they dare to raise their concerns about this anti-white discrimination, the anti-white hostility in their messaging, and this incitement to racial violence that is perpetuated through our education system, through the inaccurate dissemination of our histories, through this decolonization agenda, which is nothing more than ethnic cleansing the indigenous white populations from their own history and academia. And then this whole critical race theory ideology of only black and ethnic minorities have been oppressed, and that the only way they can be free from this oppression is getting rid of us entirely. How dare they make this a main form of so-called education? So I'm going to go into my experiences at my university. I've got some notes for this because it's quite detailed, but I'll try to go through it as quickly as possible and then go into the difficulties that I faced trying to access my legal rights as a white student pursuing discrimination claims against an educational provider. So this brings me on to my own personal experiences within higher education when studying with my former university. So back in 2020, during the COVID-19 lockdowns, I decided that I wanted to study and retrain in an area that would be less vulnerable to economic downturn and the advancements of AI technologies. I also wanted to study something that I'd be very passionate about, and the disparity in the implementation of our laws, which is quite evident depending on your racial characteristics and your political leaning, is something that I certainly am passionate about challenging. Also, studying law would fit in line with my long-term objectives. So I enrolled on an online course. I thought that studying online would protect me somewhat from lefty student rabid mobs and the majority of the left-wing propaganda, because I just wanted to get my head down, focus on my studies and qualify. I didn't want to get involved in any debates or any extracurricular activities. I wanted to avoid all of that. But unfortunately, it's near enough impossible because left-wing propaganda is basically ingrained into your course materials, and they like you to engage in activities that are going to expose you to that. It's within every part of your life as a student, even if you're studying online. So in the first week, we had this induction week, and in the course materials, it asked me to introduce myself on this introductory forum for new law students. So I did that, and it also instructed that we read through any of the postings on there and to regularly check in and engage on the forums, because it will enhance our studies, and there's notifications and, things on there that we won't be able to find elsewhere. So I'm going through these forum posts, and I notice there's a lot of links, so I'm exploring the website, and I become aware that there is an awful lot of anti-white messaging. I mean, it didn't help that it was Black History Month at the time, so there was a lot of anti-white decolonization and whites are to blame for everything and critical race theory-based nonsense. But also, most concerningly, was that this discrimination and harassment seems to go down into the university's very policies. For example, they had a bursary scheme for socioeconomically disadvantaged students, but it excluded white disadvantaged students from applying. This bursary scheme would give these students £1,500 for each of their first 2 years of study to help them because, well, they're apparently socioeconomically disadvantaged, but they can't help the white ones. There was also student groups, like support groups only for Black and ethnic minorities, consultations to see how things are going and what services and what help could be made available, only open to Black and ethnic minorities. The Students' Union wanted a bank account for Blacks and ethnic minorities to be able to access to help them with their studies and any associated costs, but white students wouldn't be able to access this. And eventually, what I decided to do was I replied with a very innocuous statement to one of these posts on this introductory law forum, which was full of Marxist propaganda. And I just said that I find this Marxist propaganda unnecessary and divisive on an introductory forum for new students. And I really didn't expect much of a response, if I'm going to be honest. I really did underestimate the rabidness of the lefty mobs, because a couple of days later, I log back in and I look at this forum, and there is a whole thread of responses. And some of them were quite positive and they agreed with me. But over time, more and more left-wing students came in. And one in particular had decided to seek out and maliciously publish my personal identifying information. So, I didn't mind if people wanted to disagree, but that kind of action of doxing is meant to intimidate and bully students, and I wasn't going to accept that. So I decided to raise some formal complaints with the head of student experience. I raised them about the conduct of the students on that forum, the harassment, the bullying, the abuse, and the doxing of my personal identifying information, and also my concerns about the racially discriminatory practices, policies, and provisions that would put me as a white student at a disadvantage. So the forum was closed down, and I actually have the transcripts for this forum. There was a conversation that went down between me and other students, and I'm happy to make those available. In fact, I'll talk about them in the next video, the content of what I published, so you can decide whether you think it was offensive or not. So I eventually got a response from the student experience manager, who stated that she didn't feel that it was necessary to include white students in any support systems or initiatives, or that there was any indication that white students would require these things. So, and I also that I was to expect a response about my complaints in the near future. A few days later, I received a response from a colleague of the student experience manager, one of the student support team, who informed me that they were not going to be doing anything about my complaints, not against the students who maliciously published my personal identifying information, not about the anti-white comments that were published on the forum, or my concerns. They weren't going to address my concerns about the racially discriminatory practices, policies, or the racially hostile environment that we're being subjected to by this bombardment of anti-white propaganda. They weren't going to address that at all. Instead, I was going to be disciplined. So of course I contested this and asked them to please quote something that I'd written on that forum that would be a breach of the student rules, the student charter they call it. And they came back to me and stated that that my comments may not be shared by other pupils or students, and that they may find them offensive. And in particular, I'm being disciplined for one sentence, which wasn't just a standalone comment within the forum. It was part of a debate about racial discrimination within society, where I'd stated that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization. So that was what they wanted to discipline me for. So I, of course, again contested this, and I emailed this member of the faculty back, and I stated that their comments of their anti-white policies being anti-racist were not anti-racist, they were just anti-white. And that Black Lives Matter being a terrorist organization is not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of fact, because they would meet all of the criteria that is outlined within the Terrorism Act of 2000. They have committed numerous violent actions and acts of intimidation for political means. They are an Afrocentric terrorist organization. I also outlined in a separate email the responsibilities of my educational provider underneath the Equality Act of 2010 and their contractual obligations, and also their obligations under our Human Rights Act of 1998 to uphold our freedom of speech. But they didn't seem to hold much weight with them. They seemed to think that their personal policies or policies of their organization override these pieces of legislation, or they just don't apply to white students or white people in general. So I continued on with my studies, and I attended a seminar where the professor brought up a discussion, a debate, on whether the British Constitution should be fully codified or not. I held the position that yes, indeed, it should be fully codified, because certain unwritten principles and values can become undermined. And especially with our changing demographics, this is becoming more evident. Even things so fundamental like equality before the law has become undermined with the implementation of Sharia courts, for example, that treat women as half that of a man. So this got discussions shut down, and I was told that changes to our law due to changing demographics was something that I would just have to get used to. Then I got a phone call eventually from one of the student support team to address my concerns. And I spoke to this member who basically told me on the phone call that they don't want to discriminate against white students and they don't feel that they are. They feel that they're evening the playing field. Now, this is written in their internal emails as well. So at this stage, I thought it would be impossible for me to, get any sort of reasonable response or be able to deal with these things internally, because I was being ignored, blockaded, and told that my opinions don't really matter and that the legislation that I was referring to doesn't apply to them. So I decided to contact the Equality Advisory Service. I found them online on Google, and it said they were a non-legal body that offers advice to people that feel that they might be being discriminated against. So I gave them a call and I spoke to an agent on there who listened to my concerns, and they said that I might have a legal claim now. And they passed me through to the legal aid agency on that same phone call. And from there, they did an assessment and I was automatically assigned a legal aid solicitor. And that legal aid solicitor started working on my behalf to look at the merits of my claims of discrimination. So from there, I started working with this legal aid solicitor. I spoke about the details of my case, I sent over evidence to support my claims, and they submitted a subject access request on my behalf. While we were waiting for that information to come through, I continued with my studies and also started to do some research to see if my educational provider, my former university, had any other complaints by white students or other students complaining of racial and political discrimination. And during my research, I came across a few complaints that I found online. One in particular was on a website called What Do They Know? And it was another student, I thought, that was complaining about the statements of support for the terrorist organization known as Black Lives Matter, and also about the racially discriminatory practices and policies of my former university. And I managed to get in contact with the person who wrote this, and I had a discussion with them. And they talked about it was actually their son and how their son had been racially discriminated against and he was disabled. And he ended up actually dropping out of his course and was in debt because of it and had suffered anxiety and depression, and they hadn't managed to get any justice for this. And then I received my subject access request, which contained the emails, the internal emails between the faculty and staff of my former educational provider. And from those emails, I found out that not only had my personal identifying information been published on those forums in a malicious manner trying to incite violence towards me, it had also been published on more public platforms such as Twitter, but they'd never bothered to inform me of this. I also found out that because I had the wrong opinions, but they didn't feel that they could discipline me for them, instead had decided to try and report me to Prevent. And this was for statements such as Black Lives Matter are a terrorist organisation, and for my comments during the debate that took place regarding the British Constitution, where I stated that women's equality under the law was becoming undermined by Sharia courts. Apparently, now, women's equality before the law is an extremist view. Who knew? But I found out that also there were other white students who were making complaints, particularly within the law department. And I became concerned because some of these emails, even though the names were redacted, because of the nature of the content, you could whittle it down to who it was who had sent them. And I became aware that my own professor, my tutor, was one of the people that held these very biased views and was trying to maliciously discipline me. In fact, they had tried to discipline me or wanted to discipline me for my comments on that discussion regarding the British Constitution, but decided that it didn't breach the student charter. So I got the results of my first assignment back, and even though they were very good, they weren't as high as what I was expecting. So I decided that I was not only going to ask for that to be reviewed by an independent body, because I didn't believe that my personal professor was going to mark that in an unbiased manner, considering that I had seen the content of her internal emails that were very negatively minded towards me and very malicious in some circumstances and untruthful. So I wished for that to be reviewed, and I also decided to go onto a forum which was on the student support team's own forums where you're allowed to post complaints. And I wrote onto there, basically reaching out to other students, asking them if they felt that they had been politically or racially discriminated against by the university, and if they did, to please get in contact with me because I may be pursuing legal action if these matters could not be resolved internally. Shortly after I had put this up, about an hour later, I received an email stating that they had taken down this post that I had put up for other students, asking them if they felt if they'd been politically or racially discriminated against or treated in an unfair and biased manner by the university or any of its staff, and that I might be subject to a disciplinary. I know, another disciplinary. So I had to reiterate to them what their obligations were underneath the Equality Act of 2010, offered once again to try resolve these matters internally, reminded them that anybody who makes a claim, a complaint, or an allegation of discrimination related to the Equality Act are protected by law underneath the Equality Act, as these are protected acts. And to subject me to a detriment, which certainly a disciplinary would be classed as victimisation, which means they had yet again breached the Equality Act of 2010. But once again, they didn't think that this legislation applied to them, or really, they were overly confident in thinking that somebody from the white working class who comes from a socio-economically disadvantaged background isn't going to bring these matters to court. And maybe they knew more than I did about how the legal aid solicitors work. So I continued with my course and I asked to be given a new professor, a new head tutor, and they started looking for one of them, and that was given to me in a few weeks. And my assessment, the initial assessment that I thought was being downgraded by the previous professor that was my main professor who'd marked this particular assessment, and that was marked up but only just slightly. And then my legal aid solicitor contacted me as a matter of urgency, stating that I must protectively issue my claims with the county courts because it's reaching its limitation date. And they sent me paperwork and I did as instructed and I sent it off to the county courts. Well, I actually physically took it there. And then about a week and a half later, I received this paperwork back from the courts telling me that they weren't going to protectively issue it because there was too many inconsistencies and mistakes. Now, this was a professional solicitor's firm that had made these numerous mistakes. And I remember being on the phone to the one of their employees who basically said to me, you know, that, oh, you need to do this. Have you read through it? And he sounded kind of nervous at the time. So from there, our relationship started to break down. It didn't help that I couldn't contact them over this space of time that I had, which was about 2.5 days. Over that weekend, I didn't have any reply to my emails or phone calls, and I told them it's a matter of urgency because if we don't get this paperwork sorted by Monday morning, I might not be able to bring my claims to court. And I couldn't get hold of them, so I decided that I was going to fill in these forms and issue them myself, which I did do on that Monday morning. And then I went to the gym. And this legal aid solicitor contacted me as I'm on the cross trainer, and I explained to him that the paperwork that he'd filled out was, you know, so inconsistent and so poorly done that the courts wouldn't even accept it. And I found it actually very negligent how he'd put my claim at risk like that. And there wasn't even really a proper apology. And basically they made excuses about my not being able to contact them. So the relationship really started to break down with my legal aid solicitor from that. So a few weeks after I protectively issued my claims with the county courts, I heard a knock on my door early in the morning. And I was in my pajamas and I went to go answer it. I was expecting some deliveries from things that I'd ordered online. But when I answered the door, I was greeted by 2 plainclothes officers and 3 uniformed officers, all male and very tall. So I asked them what they were doing at my property, and they responded by saying that they were there on behalf of my university to ask me why I had issues with Black Lives Matter. So I asked them, do they have a warrant? Because I was quite irritated by this, and they said no. So I responded by telling them that they weren't just intimidating a student on behalf of a university because of non-adherence to Marxist ideology, but they were also intimidating a claimant on behalf of a respondent or the defendant in a civil claim, a civil dispute. And they rapidly left my property, and I told them that if they didn't come back with a warrant or returned without one, I would certainly pursue claims of trespass against them. I was actually quite annoyed after they left because I hadn't videoed this, and I'd actually got into the habit of wearing a body cam. And I also didn't catch exactly where they were from, but due to the fact that I know from the internal emails of the subject access request, I'm aware that the university had maliciously reported me to Prevent, so I will assume that that was who it was that came knocking on my door that morning. So I continued with my course, and I passed that first year with a very high mark, and I was quite pleased with that considering all the stress and extra work that I had to put in because of these complaints and detriments that they'd subjected me to. I started to apply for this bursary scheme that they offer to students within their first 2 years, and it was turned down on the basis that I was white. My relationship with my legal aid solicitor completely broke down. I mean, they sent off some details to a barrister to do a merits assessment, and they left out important information. This barrister didn't even look up any data in relation to whether a defence of positive action could actually be used or not. So this merits assessment, I felt, was done in a very biased manner. So I decided to no longer utilise this legal aid solicitor and try to apply for another, and I was denied. So then I wanted to look into independent advice. So I started talking to some barrister and solicitor friends of mine. Unfortunately, none of them could work on this case pro bono at this point in time because they were really busy. But I did have a trusted barrister's firm, and they said that they would be able to help me write the particulars of the claim because my legal aid solicitor hadn't done this yet, and help support me through the courts. I mean, without actually being a legal aid claimant, though, you would not have the protections from, being indemnified for adverse costs. So that was the major concern, because obviously you're then threatened with, if you lose, you will have to pay the costs of the other side. And if you're already socioeconomically disadvantaged, this could mean bankruptcy. So this is what usually deters a lot of people from moving forward at that stage. But I decided that I was going to try and crowdfund this. So I went to an official site called Crowd Justice, and I wrote out a campaign, and I stated who the barrister was, who would be representing my case should we raise enough money. I got my pledges ready. I had people ready to donate, and I was all excited for this campaign launch, and it just never got verified. And I contacted them on numerous occasions, and they never communicated back with me. In fact, my campaign stayed on hold. So I was unable to access legal aid. I was unable to crowdfund. Because I have the wrong opinions, it was very difficult for me to communicate because I'd been cancelled from most social media. So the only option that I had left available to me was to learn the civil procedure rules, learn the legislation, write the particulars of claim myself, issue these claims on the respondents and with the county courts, and move forward as a litigant in person, which is what I am now doing. So I have advanced several legal claims against the respondent, my former university, underneath the Equality Act of 2010 for direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, victimisation for when I've raised my complaints and concerns, but most importantly, the claims that have the most wide-reaching implications, and why it is important that I speak openly about this case is because I have claimed that the critical race theory-based teachings within the university that describe whiteness and the characteristics of the white race in a constant negative and derogatory manner, plus the inaccurate disseminations of our history meant to stir up racial animosity towards white indigenous populations, creates an intimidating, degrading and hostile environment for white students, which is a contravention of the Equality Act 2010 harassment. And it is an act of harassment, and if it is recognised as such, then we could see critical race theory banned throughout our education system. Then I have also claimed that I have been discriminated against due to my philosophical and factual beliefs underneath the Granger versus Nicholson case law, as I have been discriminated against and subject to a detriment for stating that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organisation, and for stating that basically white people are the only peoples who are systemically discriminated against in our society. So if these claims were to be successful, we could see Black Lives Matter having to be prescribed as a terrorist organisation, because if a court upholds my statement that Black Lives Matter is indeed a terrorist organisation, then surely Parliament would then have to discuss it. And if my claims of critical race theory brings about racial harassment, because it's unwarranted conduct related to race that creates an intimidating, hostile and degrading atmosphere, without a doubt. So if that is upheld, hopefully we will be able to see critical race theory banned throughout our education system. I also claimed that my respondent, my former university, doesn't really include the white working class inside their equality measurements. So they're never included in any kind of initiatives to increase participation. And this is because of this critical race theory-based belief that all white people are privileged, despite the fact that the white working class are one of the lowest demographics going on into higher education and have some of the lowest achievement records for any ethnic group within Great Britain, for example. So this is why I think it's important that I speak about this. It's not just a matter of our equality within education. It's not just a matter of the lifelong impact that this discrimination in education has towards the white indigenous communities who are suffering immeasurably from things like poverty, unemployment, homelessness, deaths of despair, that this kind of discrimination only compounds. And it's not just the long-lasting impact that it has on the lives of those white students who are discriminated against. For example, one of the ways in which I've been discriminated against is when we're afforded opportunity to meet potential employers for internships and training contracts that are necessary to fully qualify as either a barrister or solicitor. In many instances, these are only offered to Black and ethnic minorities, which means in society we're seeing a mass increase that is disproportionate to society of peoples being called to the bar who are non-Indigenous to this country. White peoples are paying for a qualification to not be able to go on into a meaningful career afterwards because they're being excluded from the opportunities to do so. And that impacts the wider white community as a whole. Also, the difficulty that I've had when raising these concerns and complaints and trying to even go through the legal process, where I have been intimidated, dissuaded, and even sabotaged. This is a matter of white people not being able to access their legal rights. And if we can't access our legal rights, then they don't really exist. And then there is the very dark intent behind this ideology that they're pushing, critical race theory-based white eradicationist agenda and this inaccurate dissemination of our histories. It is meant to not just stir up racial animosity towards us, but create a climate ripe for violent genocide. And this is why it is so important that not only myself brings forward claims in the courts against any of these institutions teaching these hateful ideologies of critical race theory and decolonization or discriminating against the white indigenous population, be it in employment, be it in recreational sports, be it in any form of opportunity and in education, particularly if you're a white parent and you can see that your child who works really hard is being discriminated against and treated less favorably because they are white, when they are being subjected to psychological trauma to demoralize them and make them hate themselves, their history, their heritage, their culture, their family. You should speak up against this. And if you are subjected to a detriment, if they try to intimidate and dissuade you, then I encourage you to move forward with the courts. Now, I'm not going to lie, it is an incredibly tedious task that involves an awful lot of hard work if you're going to pursue the legal route against your educational provider or any other institution that is discriminating against you as a white person. If you're from the white working class, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to afford the extortionate costs of having private representation. And I'm not sure whether people are aware of this, but many peoples in law have sworn oaths to diversity, equality, and inclusivity, so actively try to dissuade white claimants from pursuing discrimination claims underneath the Equality Act of 2010. So you might find it difficult to be able to secure a legal aid solicitor that you do trust, but if you are lucky enough to do so, I would say certainly move forward with any claims that have merit, because it's so important that we start challenging this now. for the sake of our communities. And I'm going to be putting out further videos. I understand that this one's been quite long, but I wanted to detail exactly what had happened between me and my former university and why I was bringing action against them. But in the next few videos, I'll try to summarize this down to like 5 or 6 minutes, but I will also offer some of my experiences in trying to pursue legal action, the pitfalls of that. And I will not be able to offer any legal advice. I'm not legally trained. I'm a novice litigant in person. But I will discuss the issues that I've faced when attempting to bring action as a litigant in person or a member of the white working class, when trying to access things like legal aid, and offer the pros and cons that I can see, that and then let you make your own mind up from there. But if you would like to see further content, the videos that I'm going to publish after this, which the next one will be the content of the forum, my responses to that. Following that will be access to legal rights and the struggle that the white working class have. And then following this will be a different topic altogether, which will be Bubba Kate versus the state of white genocide denial. If you would like to see more content, please like and subscribe. I have a channel on Telegram. Most of my other mainstream social media keeps getting cancelled, so you might not see it too often on there. These official episodes won't come out too often. Like I've said, I'm not really a content creator, and quite a lot of the time I'm working on active solutions. But if you would like any updates, please do subscribe. And when the website's out, you can subscribe to my newsletter. Thank you very much, and I will give you updates soon.